The moving truck pulled away from our new home in Oak Ridge Estates as I helped my mom unpack the kitchen boxes. After 5 years in a cramped apartment, our family finally had a real house with a yard. A beautiful 2-story colonial with navy blue shutters on a quiet cul-de-sac. "What do you think, Ellie?" Mom asked, handing me a stack of plates. "Was it worth the wait?" "It's perfect," I said, glancing out the window at the pristine neighborhood. Every lawn was manicured, every mailbox matched, and children rode bikes along smooth sidewalks. My 14-year-old self couldn't believe we actually lived here now. Dad walked in carrying more boxes. "Did you see the community pool? Olympic-sized. And there's a tennis court too." What we didn't fully understand yet was that this paradise came with a price beyond the mortgage. The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist, hidden beneath a velvet glove. The welcome basket arrived that afternoon, delivered by Constance Wheeler herself, HOA president for the past 8 years. She was in her 50s, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair, a tennis tan, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're just delighted to have a judge living in our community," she said to my father, practically gushing. "So prestigious. And what does your wife do?" "I'm a pediatric nurse," Mom said. "How nice," Constance replied, her enthusiasm noticeably dimmer. Her eyes darted around our half-unpacked living room. "I've included a copy of our community bylaws and covenants. It's rather extensive, but we find it keeps our property values among the highest in the county." The binder she handed over was 3 inches thick. "I look forward to seeing you at the monthly meeting next week," she added. "We're voting on some improvements to the regulations." After she left, Dad flipped through the binder. Pretty standard stuff. Lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, holiday decoration guidelines. "Seems reasonable," Mom agreed. 2 days later, I was shooting baskets in our driveway when a white SUV slowed in front of our house. Constance Wheeler rolled down her window and called out sweetly, "Basketball hoops must be stored in garages when not actively in use." Community Guideline 17B. Just a friendly reminder. She drove away before I could respond. That night at dinner, I mentioned the interaction. "That's weird," Dad said, frowning. "I don't remember seeing anything about basketball hoops in the bylaws." He found the relevant section. Recreational equipment must be properly stored when not in active use to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. "That's pretty vague," Mom said. 3 days later, our first official warning arrived in the mail. Our violation. Unapproved recreational equipment visible from street. "This is ridiculous," Dad muttered. "It's a basketball hoop, not a junkyard." Little did we know, this was just the beginning of Constance Wheeler's special welcome for the Sullivan family. A week into our new life at Oak Ridge Estates, I heard Mom's frustrated voice from the front yard. I stepped outside to find her talking to a thin man in khakis and a polo shirt embroidered with OHA compliance officer. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've received complaints about your garden border," he said, gesturing to the small stone edging Mom had installed around her flower bed. "Complaints? I just put these in yesterday," Mom said. "Landscape borders must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee before installation. That's in Section 23C of your covenant agreement." "They're just stones," Mom argued. "Unapproved stones," he corrected. "The committee meets monthly to review applications. Or you can remove them within 48 hours to avoid the fine." After he left, Mom was fuming. "This is absurd. The neighbors has similar borders." Dad looked across the street. "Those are brick, not stone. Maybe there's a list of pre-approved materials." We found it buried in an appendix. Only brick, pressure-treated wood, or black metal borders were permitted. Stone borders required special approval due to potential aesthetic inconsistency. Mom reluctantly removed her stones, replacing them with the approved black metal edging that cost twice as much. We thought that would be the end of it. We were wrong. 3 days later, Constance Wheeler herself knocked on our door, holding a pink slip of paper. The moving truck pulled away from our new home in Oak Ridge Estates as I helped my mom unpack the kitchen boxes. After 5 years in a cramped apartment, our family finally had a real house with a yard. A beautiful 2-story colonial with navy blue shutters on a quiet cul-de-sac. "What do you think, Ellie?" Mom asked, handing me a stack of plates. "Was it worth the wait?" "It's perfect," I said, glancing out the window at the pristine neighborhood. Every lawn was manicured, every mailbox matched, and children rode bikes along smooth sidewalks. My 14-year-old self couldn't believe we actually live here now. Dad walked in carrying more boxes. "Did you see the community pool? Olympic-sized. And there's a tennis court too." What we didn't fully understand yet was that this paradise came with a price beyond the mortgage. The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist, hidden beneath a velvet glove. The welcome basket arrived that afternoon, delivered by Constance Wheeler herself, HOA president for the past 8 years. She was in her 50s, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair, a tennis tan, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're just delighted to have a judge living in our community," she said to my father, practically gushing. "So prestigious. And what does your wife do?" "I'm a pediatric nurse," Mom said. "How nice," Constance replied, her enthusiasm noticeably dimmer. Her eyes darted around our half-unpacked living room. "I've included a copy of our community bylaws and covenants. It's rather extensive, but we find it keeps our property values among the highest in the county." The binder she handed over was 3 inches thick. "I look forward to seeing you at the monthly meeting next week," she added. "We're voting on some improvements to the regulations." After she left, Dad flipped through the binder. Pretty standard stuff. Lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, holiday decoration guidelines. "Seems reasonable," Mom agreed. 2 days later, I was shooting baskets in our driveway when a white SUV slowed in front of our house. Constance Wheeler rolled down her window and called out sweetly, "Basketball hoops must be stored in garages when not actively in use." Community Guideline 17B. Just a friendly reminder. She drove away before I could respond. That night at dinner, I mentioned the interaction. "That's weird," Dad said, frowning. I don't remember seeing anything about basketball hoops in the bylaws. He found the relevant section. Recreational equipment must be properly stored when not in active use to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. "That's pretty vague," Mom said. 3 days later, our first official warning arrived in the mail. Our violation. Unapproved recreational equipment visible from street. "This is ridiculous," Dad muttered. "It's a basketball hoop, not a junkyard." Little did we know, this was just the beginning of Constance Wheeler's special welcome for the Sullivan family. A week into our new life at Oak Ridge Estates, I heard Mom's frustrated voice from the front yard. I stepped outside to find her talking to a thin man in khakis and a polo shirt embroidered with "Over-Compliance Officer." "Mrs. Sullivan, we've received complaints about your garden border," he said, gesturing to the small stone edging Mom had installed around her flower bed. "Complaints? I just put these in yesterday," Mom said. "Landscape borders must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee before installation. That's in Section 23C of your covenant agreement." "They're just stones," Mom argued. "Unapproved stones," he corrected. "The committee meets monthly to review applications. Or you can remove them within 48 hours to avoid the fine." After he left, Mom was fuming. "This is absurd. The neighbors have similar borders." Dad looked across the street. "Those are brick, not stone. Maybe there's a list of pre-approved materials." We found it buried in an appendix. Only brick, pressure-treated wood, or black metal borders were permitted. Stone borders required special approval due to potential aesthetic inconsistency. Mom reluctantly removed her stones, replacing them with the approved black metal edging that cost twice as much. We thought that would be the end of it. We were wrong. 3 days later, Constance Wheeler herself knocked on our door, holding a pink slip of paper. "Your trees need pruning," she announced without preamble. "We have community standards for canopy height." Dad stepped onto the porch. "The trees? We just moved in. They've been that way for years." Previous owners had a grandfather exemption that expired upon sale. Constance replied smoothly, "You have 2 weeks to bring them into compliance or face a $100 weekly fine. The HOA can also hire a service at your expense if you fail to comply." After she left, Dad discovered the tree canopy height regulations in Section 41D, requiring all trees to maintain a minimum 7-foot clearance from the ground to ensure uniform street appearance and safety. "This is getting ridiculous," Dad said, examining our perfectly normal maple trees. That weekend, we attended our first HOA meeting in the community clubhouse. Constance presided over the gathering like a queen holding court. When Dad raised his hand to question the tree regulation, Constance cut him off. "New homeowners have a 3-month observation period before being permitted to raise objections at meetings," she announced, though no one could find this rule in writing. On our way out, an older gentleman approached us. "I'm Walter Jenkins," he whispered. "Been here 12 years. Word of advice, don't make waves." Constance has friends on the county zoning board and the bank that holds most of the mortgages here. "Is that a threat?" Dad asked. "Just neighborhood history," Walter replied. "The last family that challenged her ended up with so many violations and fines they had to sell at a loss." Coincidentally, to Constance's daughter. That night, Dad stayed up late reading every page of the HOA covenant. As a district court judge, he was no stranger to legal documents, but even he was surprised by the labyrinthine rules governing our new neighborhood. "They've created their own little fiefdom here," he told Mom. "But everyone has to follow the actual law, even HOAs." It became clear. Constance wasn't just enforcing rules. She was making an example of us. By our 2nd month in Oakridge Estates, the warnings were arriving weekly. Our garbage cans had been visible from the street for excessive duration, retrieved 30 minutes after pickup instead of immediately. Our mailbox was improperly maintained, needed repainting though it matched the house perfectly. Even my bike, left on the front porch for 15 minutes, while I ran inside for water, triggered a violation notice. "This is harassment," Mom said, adding another pink slip to the growing collection on our fridge. Dad was beginning to agree. They've issued us 8 violations in 6 weeks, but the Petersons next door have a cracked driveway that's been that way for months. The tipping point came when Mom planted a small vegetable garden in our backyard. She'd carefully measured to ensure it was within the permitted recreational cultivation area specified in the bylaws. The tomato plants were barely 6 inches tall when Constance appeared at our back gate. "Vegetable gardens are limited to ground-level cultivation only," she declared, pointing at the single tomato cage Mom had installed. That structure wasn't approved by the architectural committee. "It's a tomato cage," Mom said incredulously. "It's not even visible from the street. Rules are rules, Mrs. Sullivan. Remove it by tomorrow or face a fine." After she left, our neighbor Maria Rodriguez peeked over the fence. I couldn't help overhearing. "She made me remove my entire garden last year because my cucumber trellis was 6 inches too tall." "This is absurd," Mom said. "It gets worse," Maria confided. "My husband and I tried to fight it, so they started targeting his work truck. He's a plumber, and they claimed commercial vehicles couldn't be parked in driveways overnight. He now parks 3 blocks away and walks home." Dad frowned. "That doesn't sound right. Most work vehicles are protected under state law as long as they're not over a certain weight class." "Try telling that to Constance," Maria sighed. "We've been saving to move, but we're underwater on our mortgage after the special assessment last year." "Special assessment?" $5,000 per household for landscape enhancements. mainly new plants around Constance's and the board members' properties. They called an emergency meeting when half the neighborhood was away on spring break. That weekend, other neighbors began approaching us discreetly. The Wilsons had been fined because their Christmas lights stayed up 3 days past the January 6th deadline due to a family emergency. The elderly Mr. Abernathy received weekly violations for his lawn, though he paid a service recommended by the HOA. "It's a protection racket," Dad muttered as we compiled the stories. "They target anyone who doesn't fall in line." Dad started attending city council meetings, quietly researching HOA regulations. He discovered that Oak Ridge's board hadn't held a proper election in 3 years, violating state law requiring annual votes. When he raised this at the next HOA meeting, Constance smiled thinly. "Judge Sullivan, while we appreciate your legal expertise, our bylaws supersede general statute in matters of governance." "That's not how the law works," Dad replied. 2 days later, we received a certified letter. The HOA was issuing us a $1,500 fine for unauthorized landscape modifications and demanding immediate removal of Mom's entire garden. They claimed aerial roots from the tomato plants might damage the subdivision's drainage system. "This is scientifically impossible," Mom said, waving the notice. "Tomato roots are shallow." Dad's expression hardened. "They're not just being unreasonable, they're abusing their authority." The next day, I arrived home from school to find an official-looking man taking photographs of our house. When questioned, he identified himself as an HOA compliance documentation specialist, cataloging our multiple violations. That evening, we held a family meeting. "I think it's time to fight back," Dad said quietly. "Not just for us, but for everyone in this neighborhood." The final straw came on a sweltering July afternoon. I was hosting 3 friends from my new school for a study session when a tow truck pulled into our driveway. The driver approached our front door with a clipboard. "I'm here for the blue Honda Civic," he announced. "HOA violation removal." Mom appeared behind me, confused. "That's my car." "What violation?" "Says here, unauthorized vehicle parked in primary residence driveway without proper registration documentation." He showed us the work order, signed by Constance Wheeler herself. "That's absurd. The car is registered and legally parked in our own driveway." Mom protested. The driver shrugged. "Just doing my job, ma'am. You'll need to take it up with your HOA." Dad arrived home just as the tow truck was hooking up Mom's car. He blocked the driveway with his own vehicle and demanded to see the authorization paperwork. "This order claims the vehicle is abandoned," Dad said, reading the form. "The car was driven this morning. It's clearly not abandoned." HOA rules state that any vehicle not displaying a current Oak Ridge Estates parking permit is subject to immediate removal, the driver recited. "Parking permit." Mom looked bewildered. "What parking permit?" We later discovered buried in subsection 72E of the bylaws that all residents were required to display a $35 annual parking decal on their vehicles. A rule selectively enforced and never mentioned during our purchase or move-in. Dad convinced the tow operator to unhook the car after showing his judicial ID and promising to resolve the matter with the HOA directly. My friends watched wide-eyed as the drama unfolded in our driveway. "Your neighborhood is intense," my friend Zoe whispered as they left. That evening, a certified letter arrived by courier. It stated that due to repeated and willful violations of community standards, the Sullivan family was being called before the HOA disciplinary committee to address our pattern of non-compliance. The potential penalties included accumulated fines exceeding $4,000 and possible revocation of our community privileges. "They're trying to ban us from our own neighborhood amenities," Mom said incredulously. "The pool, the park, everything we're paying HOA fees for." Dad was silent, reviewing the letter with his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "There's more," he said gravely. This paragraph says if we don't comply with all outstanding violation notices within 10 days, they'll place a line on our property. Can they do that? I asked. Technically, yes. HOAs can file liens for unpaid dues or fines. But what they're doing goes far beyond legitimate enforcement. That night, I overheard my parents discussing whether we should cut our losses and move. The thought of leaving our dream home after just 3 months made my stomach twist. We can't let them win, Mom said finally. This isn't just about us anymore. The next morning, we discovered our yard had been inspected overnight. Small flags marked dozens of alleged violations, from excessive grass height variance. Some blades were apparently 1/8 inch too tall, to unapproved mulch coloration. When Dad called Constance to demand an explanation, her response was chilling. Judge Sullivan, perhaps your professional position has led you to believe you're above community standards. Let me assure you, no one is exempt from the rules at Oak Ridge Estates. Dad hung up and turned to us with a determined expression I'd seen before. The same look he had when he presided over difficult cases in his courtroom. They've awakened the wrong judge, he said quietly. It's time to examine exactly how this HOA has been operating. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of something beyond frustration in my father's eyes. A strategic determination that made me almost feel sorry for Constance Wheeler. Almost. While most families would have been intimidated into compliance, Constance had overlooked one crucial detail. My father wasn't just any homeowner. He was Judge Robert Sullivan, with 20 years on the district court bench and a reputation for meticulous attention to detail. Dad spent the next week in his home office with the door closed, emerging only for meals. When Mom asked what he was doing, he simply said, building a case. On day 8, he invited several neighbors for coffee in our backyard, well away from HOA security cameras that we'd recently discovered mounted on street lights. Maria and her husband came, along with the Wilsons, Mr. Abernathy, and a half-dozen other families who'd been targeted by the HOA. I've been reviewing Oak Ridge's financial records, Dad explained, spreading documents across our patio table. As a homeowner, I'm entitled to see them, though Constance made the process unnecessarily difficult. What he'd found was shocking. The HOA had been improperly commingling funds, using violation fines to pay for neighborhood improvements that primarily benefited board members' properties. The special assessment that had nearly bankrupted several families had mainly funded a complete landscape renovation of Constance's backyard, under the guise of creating a model garden. That's illegal, Maria's husband Carlos said. That's just the beginning, Dad continued. Their election procedures violate state statutes. Their architectural review committee includes Constance's brother-in-law, who owns the only approved landscaping company for the neighborhood. And their selective enforcement of rules constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. So what can we do? Asked Mrs. Wilson. They threatened anyone who challenges them. Dad smiled slightly. I filed a petition with the county court to appoint a special investigator to review the HOA's practices. As a sitting judge, I've recused myself from the case, but I've provided extensive documentation. Won't that just make Constance target us more? I asked, worried. She's already doing that, Dad replied. But there's strength in numbers. If everyone documents their experiences, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Mom handed out packets she prepared. Here's a template for recording violations, with relevant state statutes that protect homeowners' rights. We need everyone to document everything. The neighbors left with new determination, and for the first time since moving to Oak Ridge, I felt like we weren't alone. The HOA's response was swift. The next day, violation notices appeared on every door of families who'd attended our gathering. Constance scheduled an emergency board meeting where she proposed a new rule prohibiting unauthorized gatherings of more than 3 households without prior board approval, essentially trying to ban neighbors from talking to each other. Dad attended the meeting and calmly pointed out that such a rule would violate constitutional rights to peaceful assembly. When Constance attempted to have him removed, he reminded the room that all proceedings were being recorded as part of the county investigation. That evening, a small procession of cars drove slowly past our house. Board members and their allies, taking photos and making notes. It was meant to intimidate us, but instead, it galvanized the neighborhood resistance. A week later, Dad received a phone call from the county clerk. The special investigator had found sufficient evidence to escalate the matter to a full hearing. Furthermore, a temporary injunction had been granted, preventing the HOA from filing any liens or collecting any fines until the case was resolved. When Constance learned of the injunction, she left a voicemail on our home phone. "Judge Sullivan, your temporary victory will prove costly. The HOA bylaws permit us to engage legal counsel at association expense. Are you prepared to bankrupt your neighbors in this foolish crusade?" Dad played the message for the growing coalition of homeowners at our next backyard meeting. "She's bluffing," he explained. "The bylaws require a full membership vote to approve legal expenses over $10,000. She doesn't have the votes anymore." For the first time, I saw hope in our neighbors' eyes. What had begun as our family's problem had become a community awakening. The county investigation into Oakridge Estates HOA began peeling back layers of misconduct that shocked even the most skeptical homeowners. The investigator, Ms. Ramona Jefferson, was a retired fraud examiner known for her thoroughness. Using subpoena power, she obtained complete financial records that revealed a disturbing pattern. For years, the HOA had maintained two sets of books, the official records shown to homeowners and the actual accounts that tracked where money really went. Over $300,000 in fines and special assessments had been funneled into a separate account controlled solely by Constance and the treasurer, Harold Beckman. This money had paid for luxury business retreats for board members, landscaping for their personal properties, and even college tuition for Constance's grandson, all disguised as legitimate HOA expenses. When these findings became public, the unified front of the board began to crumble. Harold Beckman resigned abruptly, listing health concerns as his reason. Two other board members claimed they'd been kept in the dark about the financial improprieties and began cooperating with investigators. Constance, however, remained defiant. She called an emergency board meeting at the clubhouse, but only her most loyal allies attended. From across the street, we watched as heated arguments erupted, visible through the clubhouse windows. The next day, a dumpster appeared behind the HOA office. Neighbors observed Constance and her assistant loading boxes of documents late into the night. "They're destroying evidence," Dad said when he heard. A quick call to Ms. Jefferson resulted in county officers securing the remaining records before more could disappear. With the investigation intensifying, Constance changed tactics. She began making direct appeals to homeowners, portraying herself as the victim of a witch hunt, led by newcomers who didn't appreciate her years of dedicated service. Without strong enforcement, Oakridge would become just another declining subdivision, she wrote in a community-wide email. "Do you want your property values to plummet because Judge Sullivan thinks his tomato cages are more important than community standards?" Her appeal might have worked a month earlier, but too much had been revealed. Former board members, seeking leniency, began sharing stories of how Constance had manipulated the system for years. The former vice president revealed that the architectural review process was designed to fail applications from anyone not in Constance's favor. The landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law charged homeowners premium rates while providing substandard service, with kickbacks flowing back to certain board members. Even more damning, we discovered why our family had been targeted so aggressively from day one. Before we purchased our home, Constance's son had made an offer on the same property, intending to flip it for profit. Our higher bid had thwarted those plans, and our presence represented a personal loss to the Wheeler family business of buying, renovating, and selling homes within the neighborhood. It was never about the rules, Mom said when we learned this. It was revenge. As the investigation proceeded, daily life in Oakridge began to change. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now greeted each other openly. People gathered on front porches without fear of being reported. One brave family even installed a basketball hoop in their driveway, a small act of rebellion that would have been unthinkable months before. Constance's power base continued to erode when the county investigation expanded to include the local bank that had been complicit in some of the financial maneuvers. The bank president, a golf buddy of Constance's husband, had approved questionable loans secured by HOA dues and had expedited foreclosures on properties the Wheelers wanted to acquire. The breaking point for many longtime Constance supporters came when local news covered the story. Seeing their prestigious neighborhood portrayed as a suburban dictatorship horrified residents who valued their community's reputation. When Constance called yet another emergency meeting to rally support, only 11 people showed up, most of them related to her by blood or business interests. That night, she left a final voicemail for my father. "This isn't over, Robert. You may think you've won, but there are levels of influence you can't possibly understand." Dad played the message for Ms. Jefferson, who added it to her evidence file with a slight smile. "Threats against a sitting judge," she noted. "Not her smartest move." The next morning, we woke to find Constance's house empty, her luxury SUV gone from the driveway. Neighbors reported seeing her loading suitcases into her car around midnight. The HOA empire she had built was crumbling. But the story wasn't over yet. 3 weeks after Constance's midnight departure, the county court convened a special hearing to address the Oakridge Estates situation. The courtroom was packed with homeowners, county officials, and even reporters from the local news. Judge Patricia Mendoza, a respected jurist from the neighboring county brought in to ensure impartiality, presided over the proceedings. My father sat with our family in the gallery, having submitted all this evidence through proper channels. Ms. Jefferson presented the investigation's findings methodically, displaying financial records, emails, and sworn statements on the courtroom monitors. The evidence revealed a scheme more extensive than even we had imagined. The HOA had systematically targeted certain homeowners with excessive fines, creating financial pressure that forced them to sell, often to shell companies connected to Constance's family. They had manipulated property values through selective enforcement, steering the most desirable properties toward their associates. They had even created artificial water drainage problems in certain areas to justify special assessments that primarily funded improvements to board members' properties. Harold Beckman, the former treasurer now cooperating with authorities, testified that Constance had personally directed this strategy for nearly a decade. She called it community cultivation, he explained nervously, removing undesirable elements to maintain the neighborhood's exclusivity. When Judge Mendoza asked who qualified as undesirable, Harold's answer caused a ripple of shock through the courtroom. Anyone who might question her authority. Professionals like lawyers or judges. People who understood the rules too well. During a recess, our neighbor Maria squeezed my mom's hand. "We thought we were crazy," she whispered. "All those years thinking maybe we really were breaking rules we didn't understand." The most dramatic moment came when Constance herself was called to testify. She had returned from her brief disappearance, apparently convinced she could charm the court as she had charmed so many county officials over the years. Constance took the stand wearing a conservative blue suit, projecting an image of respectability. She portrayed herself as a dedicated volunteer who had sacrificed countless hours to maintain community standards. "Everything I did was permitted by the bylaws the homeowners agreed to when purchasing property," she insisted. If Judge Sullivan had simply followed the rules like everyone else, none of this unpleasantness would have been necessary. Judge Mendoza leafed through a document before asking, "Mrs. Wheeler, are you familiar with State Code Section 47219 regarding homeowners association governance?" Of course, Constance replied confidently. Would you please explain how your actions in selectively enforcing rules against the Sullivan family comply with the equal protection requirements in that statute? Constance's composure faltered. The board has discretion in enforcement matters. Discretion, yes. Discrimination, no, Judge Mendoza corrected. The law requires equal application of rules to all homeowners. For the next hour, Judge Mendoza methodically walked Constance through her actions, contrasting them with legal requirements. With each question, Constance's responses grew more defensive and contradictory. Finally, Judge Mendoza asked, "Mrs. Wheeler, records indicate your family enterprises purchased 17 properties in Oak Ridge Estates over the past 5 years. In 15 of those cases, the previous owners had received multiple HOA violations before selling. Do you consider that coincidental?" Constance's carefully constructed facade cracked. "We were improving the neighborhood. Someone had to maintain standards. By designing impossible standards and then profiting when people couldn't meet them." Judge Mendoza asked quietly. The courtroom fell silent. After 4 days of testimony, Judge Mendoza delivered her ruling. It was more comprehensive than anyone had anticipated. The entire Oak Ridge Estates HOA board was dissolved, with a court-appointed receiver taking control until new elections could be held. All outstanding fines and violations were invalidated. Homeowners who had been forced to sell under duress were given legal recourse to seek damages. Most significantly, Judge Mendoza issued a county-wide injunction requiring all homeowners associations to submit their enforcement actions for judicial review every 6 months, creating unprecedented oversight of HOA powers. The fundamental purpose of a homeowners association is to serve its community, not to rule it, Judge Mendoza stated. When that purpose is corrupted, intervention becomes necessary. As the hearing concluded, Constance pushed past reporters without comment, her face rigid with anger. The district attorney announced that criminal charges for financial fraud and misappropriation of funds were being considered. Outside the courthouse, neighbors who had barely spoken to each other months before embraced and exchanged phone numbers. The sense of relief was palpable. Dad was surrounded by people thanking him, but he deflected the praise. This wasn't about one family's fight, he told them. It was about restoring fairness to a community we all invested in. As we drove home, I noticed Dad was quiet. "Are you okay?" Mom asked him. He nodded slowly. "I'm thinking about all the other neighborhoods where this might be happening. Places without someone who has the legal knowledge to fight back." "So what's next?" I asked. Dad smiled. "I think it's time to fix that basketball hoop permanently in our driveway." 1 year after Judge Mendoza's landmark ruling, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed from a neighborhood of fearful, isolated homeowners into a genuine community. The spring brought our first official post-Constance neighborhood block party. Families who had once avoided eye contact now shared food and stories on our tree-lined streets. Children played on front lawns without parents anxiously checking for HOA patrols. Basketball hoops stood proudly in driveways, and gardens flourished with vegetables and flowers chosen for joy rather than compliance. The new HOA board, elected through a transparent process overseen by the court-appointed administrator, included Maria Rodriguez as president and Mr. Abernathy as treasurer. Their first official act was to reduce monthly dues by 30% while still maintaining essential services. We discovered we didn't need nearly as much money when we weren't funding the Wheeler family lifestyle. Maria announced at the first open meeting, which was held in the park rather than behind the closed doors of the clubhouse. The meeting minutes were posted publicly, financial records were available to all homeowners, and board members recused themselves from decisions affecting their own properties. All practices now required by the county-wide Sullivan Oversight Provision, as it had come to be known in legal circles. Dad had been approached by homeowners from across the state seeking advice on challenging their own problematic HOAs. He'd begun hosting monthly workshops at the community center, helping people understand their rights and the proper procedures for addressing HOA overreach. It's become a movement, Mom told me as we prepared food for the block party. People realizing they don't have to accept petty tyranny in their own neighborhoods. The legal aftermath continued to unfold. Constance and 3 former board members faced criminal charges for financial fraud. The local bank that had facilitated their schemes paid substantial settlements to affected homeowners and fired several executives. Most satisfying to many was the court order requiring the Wheeler family to divest all properties acquired through their HOA manipulation tactics. As for our house, we'd finally made it truly ours. Mum's vegetable garden now occupied a generous portion of the backyard, complete with a charming trellis system for her tomatoes and cucumbers. Dad had built a proper basketball court on the side of our driveway, and neighborhood kids gathered there most afternoons for impromptu games. During the block party, I overheard Mrs. Wilson telling a new resident, "You wouldn't recognize this place a year ago. We used to cross the street to avoid neighbors for fear they'd report some violation." "What changed things?" the newcomer asked. Mrs. Wilson pointed to our family setting up chairs on the lawn. "The Sullivans moved in and reminded us all that rules should serve people, not the other way around." Later that evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood and children played flashlight tag between houses, Dad sat on our front porch watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. "Remember when you asked what was next, after the court ruling?" he said when I joined him. I nodded. "This," he said, gesturing toward the laughing families scattered across lawns and driveways. "This is what was next, a real community." In the year since Judge Mendoza's ruling, 27 counties across the state had adopted similar oversight provisions for HOAs. 3 state legislators had introduced bills to codify these protections into state law. What had begun as our family's defense against an unreasonable HOA had sparked a movement for neighborhood governance reform. As darkness fell, someone started an impromptu concert with a guitar on their front lawn. Neighbors drifted over with camping chairs and blankets. No one checked the HOA bylaws about noise ordinances or unsanctioned gatherings. No one took pictures of violations or wrote down license plate numbers of visitors. Mr. Abernathy, who had once received weekly lawn violations, shuffled over to where my parents sat. "You know what Constance told me once?" he said, lowering himself carefully into a chair. "She said I didn't belong in Oak Ridge because I couldn't maintain standards. Said I was bringing down property values." He gestured toward the real estate sign at the entrance to our subdivision, where a banner announced, "Oak Ridge Estates, highest property value increase in the county." "Turns out people value community more than conformity," he chuckled. As if to punctuate his point, a family drove past the party looking at houses for sale. They slowed down, observing the neighborhood gathering with evident interest. Dad waved them over. "Thinking of moving to Oak Ridge? Let me tell you what makes this place special." The story of how a judge and his family stood up to an HOA and transformed a neighborhood had become part of Oak Ridge's identity, not just a tale of revenge, but of renewal. And somewhere, in a county courtroom, the Sullivan oversight provision ensured that no HOA in our county would ever again mistake control for community. The end.